Welcome here. The floor is yours.
All right, great. So just to make it clear, the thing that is idiotic about coming to Italy for 24 hours is that I'm not staying for longer. I love coming to Italy, and I don't know why I'm not staying for a whole week. In fact, I do know why, and that is because this new book, Future Perfect, is coming out on Tuesday. And in fact, I'm going to be talking about it really for the first time. So this book is kind of premiering in Milano, which is a fabulous occasion for that. And I think, in fact, it's very fitting to be discussing this book in this particular context, in the context of the Expo and all the themes that we've been hearing about today, because this is a fundamentally optimistic book. It's a book about progress, it's a book about innovation, and it's a book that has a very strong theme about smart cities as one of the major kind of engines of progress going forward, using the new technology platforms that we've created. So I'm excited to give you all a little preview of this book. I don't know when it's coming out in Italy, but it will, I'm sure. But I thought I would start actually by talking about something that is straight out of the news, the political debate in the United States. I don't know how much of you have followed this, but apparently we're having a presidential election. And we have President Obama running against Mitt Romney. And a few months ago, the president gave a speech which was much criticized, became really the most discussed speech of the campaign season. And it's become known as the "you didn't build that" speech. And it was a speech where the president was trying to talk about the role that the public sector, that the government has in supporting the innovation and creativity and entrepreneurial activity of the marketplace and the private sector. So he slightly mangled his speech. There were a couple of things that kind of went wrong in the way that he talked about it. But the line that everybody jumped on was he was talking about businesses and the fact that businesses are dependent on infrastructure and things like the internet to make money and to be a successful capitalist enterprise. And so the famous line, the notorious line is, if you've got a business, you didn't build that. That actually was not referring to the business. It was referring to something else. But then he went on to say, and this is the crucial part, he went on to say, the internet didn't get invented on its own. Government research created the internet so that all the companies could make money off the internet. And this became actually a kind of a source of debate here. We've long had the story, the narrative that visionary government funding supplied the kind of basis for the internet in the early days of ARPANET and other kind of early protocols that led to the creation of the internet and then subsequently the creation of the World Wide Web. So it's always been told as a story of kind of government spending gone right. And after Obama gave his talk, there was this debate about it actually, and a couple of folks began writing these articles saying like, no. Business really made the internet what it is today, because the internet sat around for 20 years and nobody really used it, and it wasn't until big corporations started to get interested in the internet that it actually became useful and became something that was not just an academic research tool, but actually was used by billions of people around the world. And so they were trying to rewrite this story as a story about the kind of the triumph of corporations. Now here's what I think is so interesting about this debate. In fact, this clearly maps onto the traditional kind of division between the left and the right. On the one hand, you have a story of the internet being created by big government, right? It's visionary kind of government research. That's the traditional kind of left position, the power of government in creating platforms that people can work on top of. And on the right, you have this idea that big capital has created it. It's all about the power of corporations and entrepreneurs. But the interesting thing about this is if you really try and figure out who built the internet, the answer to the question is neither of these two things. The internet was funded by government research and it was commercialized by the private sector. But the organization that really came up with the initial protocols and standards and platforms and continues to maintain them to this day, everything from the internet to the email standards, to the World Wide Web, and all these other things that have become the fabric of our electronic society, they have been created by peer networks. Loose, distributed, open collaborations between thousands of millions of people around the world, sharing their ideas, building on top of other people's ideas, adding and refining and modifying to create these extraordinary platforms that have been such a great driver of our economic growth and our cultural growth over the last 20 years. That is the institution, that is the organization that has actually been the kind of key factor in the progress, in the digital progress of the last 20 years. And it is not an organization that readily maps onto the traditional categories of the state or the market. And I think that is something that we need to take very seriously and think about, and think about the structure of the peer network as a driver of growth and innovation going forward. Here's just one thought experiment. If you took all the software in the world that had been created with open source peer networks, whether it was everything from Linux to various flavors of Unix, to the internet itself, to the web itself, to Wikipedia, to the standards in Apache that drive many web servers around the world. If you could create some kind of Dr. Evil style magnetic pulse that could immediately turn off all that software, all the software that had been kind of collectively open source authored, if you could somehow zap it all so that it would fail, what would happen? It would be a catastrophe on the scale of a world war. Every single device running Mac OS, iOS, every iPad, every iPhone, every Android device, every server on the internet, email, most of the stock markets, a huge part of our energy infrastructure, potentially our aviation systems, all of them would go offline. Now, unfortunately, you can't build such a device. It's not possible to do. But it shows you how in just 20 years we have become dependent on the incredible productive labor of these collaborative open networks that don't belong to the state and don't belong to the market. And so what I'm trying to argue in this new book is that if you believe in the kind of practical value and utility of that kind of collaboration, and if this is no longer some theory, this is not some radical graduate seminar on radical thought that people are dreaming up in a commune somewhere, right? This is something that is actually supporting the infrastructure of the modern world. Then what are the kind of political values? What are the values for kind of social change and for progress that come out of the belief in the power of peer networks? And I think there's a growing movement of folks out there who believe that tapping the kind of the creative, innovative power of peer networks is one of the great opportunities we have now for making the world a better place. I want to give you a couple of examples of it. One of the greatest examples of this in recent years, coming out of the United States, is the success of the service Kickstarter. How many people are familiar with Kickstarter? Okay, good. This is a really good one to know about. So, Kickstarter is a peer network solution to the problem of supporting creative work that is not yet supported by the marketplace. So if you are a poet trying to finish a book of poems, you're a filmmaker who's trying to get their film done, even you're a brewer who wants to brew beer and needs to get funding to create this new interesting label of beer, but you can't get traditional funding for it through the marketplace. You can't get a publisher or a music label to support your work. So how do you get it done? We believe as a society that society should fund creative work, that creative work is an important part of the health and vitality, and innovation at the edges of creativity is important for society. So in the past, if you were in this zone, you really had two options. You would go to a wealthy patron who'd made a lot of money in the market and had created some kind of foundation. In the United States, we have things like the MacArthur Foundation and the Duke Foundation. And you would ask for a grant from this big pile of money that some incredibly wealthy person had created to support the arts. Or you would go to the state. You would go to, in our case, the National Endowment for the Arts, the kind of largest national funder of the arts. And you would get a grant to finish your creative project, right? And for 100 years, these have been the two options, kind of a big pile of, a mega wealthy patron or the government. But what Kickstarter said is, what if, instead of those two big institutions, what if we looked to the crowd? What if we built a peer network of supporters for projects that were creative and interesting, but that hadn't yet found sufficiency in the marketplace. And that's what Kickstarter does. You go to Kickstarter, you create a project, you say, I'm trying to finish this. You set up a series of rewards for anybody who contributes. So if you get $5, you get a signed copy of the CD. If you contribute $30, you get invited to a party. If you contribute $1,000, the artist will show up at your house and serenade you with their acoustic guitar. Whatever, you can set up whatever rewards you want. And they set this service up 3 years ago. And it has been a huge success because the world, it turns out, is filled with people who will happily give $10 or $20 or $30 to support something they think is interesting. This is not some idealist fairy tale. This is a living, breathing, practical reality. And 3 years into its existence, Kickstarter is now on track to give hundreds of millions of dollars to artists around the country. And its budget this year, in terms of the money it's giving out, is going to be larger than that of the National Endowment for the Arts. So in 3 years, this little startup has gotten the size of the NEA. So now the question is not, does this thing work? Of course it works. The question is this thing going to be 10 times as big as the NEA? Because it's unlocked all this kind of diverse, decentralized interest in supporting the arts. That is the power of peer networks in supporting these problems. It's not the traditional state approach. It's not the traditional market approach. It's something fundamentally different. Now, this does not mean that there isn't a role for taxpayer-funded innovation or research or creativity. It's just that the way of structuring it in that Kickstarter style may be ultimately more powerful because people feel like they're actually steering their dollars towards the things that they're most interested in. Effectively, it decentralizes and diversifies the decision-making process about what creative work should be supported. Now, a lot of the examples that I talk about in the book that one can draw upon now are technological in nature. They involve websites and services and APIs and platforms, some of the things you've already heard about. But I want to stress here that this is not necessarily all about high technology, and that the peer network approach actually works in low-tech environments as well. So there's a kind of extraordinary story from about 15 years ago. A couple, Jerry and Monique Sternin, were invited by Save the Children to go and try and tackle this problem of chronic childhood malnutrition in Vietnam, in the kind of rice paddy farming communities of Vietnam. Now, the traditional way that you would solve this kind of problem or try and help with this kind of problem is that you would come in as the outside expert, you'd kind of helicopter in, drop down into these communities and kind of teach them how to, feed themselves better, or maybe come up with the supply of food from the outside and drop it in, and hopefully the children would eat more food and they would survive longer and have healthier lives as adults. But the problem with that, of course, is that ultimately that kind of intervention isn't very sustainable. When the supply of food runs out, the population goes back to being undernourished and so on. So the Sternins decided to take a different approach. They decided to approach it from the inside, from the bottom up, to take a peer network approach to solving this problem. So they went in, and the first thing they did was they spent time in these communities, and they looked for what they called positive deviants in the community, i.e., individuals in the community that were breaking from the norm or the average in a good way, in a positive way. And so they just went around and they weighed babies, they weighed children. And they found the families of kind of hundreds and hundreds of families that they looked at. They found families where the children were actually getting more nourishment than the average family in the community. And once they found those families where the kids were actually getting enough food, they then did this very kind of rich ethnographic study where they tried to figure out what was it about their diet that differentiated them from all their peers in that community. And what they found was the kids who were healthier were actually being fed this slightly different diet in the sense that they were being fed kind of little crabs and other kind of shellfish that lived in the rice paddies that were seen as very low class. So most people didn't eat them, but actually they were very valuable sources of protein that were there in the society, in the community, readily available to anyone who would feed them to their kids, but they were generally scorned. So they had this solution sitting there in their midst, but people weren't using it. And so then, once they discovered this by analyzing the positive deviants, they then had the community members themselves share the information. So instead of saying, as outside experts, here's the solution to your problem, just feed your kids more shrimp, they had the families hold little potluck dinners where everybody came over and they would feed them the shrimp. And slowly but surely, word began to spread out. And when they went back 10 years later, they found that the initial effect, in terms of positive effect they'd had on childhood malnutrition, had continued and sustained itself through another generation. So they looked for the solution inside the community, and they allowed the word of that solution to spread through the peers inside the community. And the most advanced piece of technology that they used in doing this was the scale they used to weigh the kids. So this is not just a technological problem, it's a conceptual, it's a social architecture we're talking about here. It's not just a digital architecture. Now, one of the key values that comes out of this when you think about progress, when you think about innovation in this way, is a slightly different take on the value of diversity. This is not the traditional kind of political, multicultural argument for diversity. This is not the social tolerance argument for diversity. But rather, this is the argument that when you widen the number of people who are participating in decision-making processes, when you widen the number of people who are contributing their projects to Kickstarter or who are funding projects on Kickstarter, when you make a more diverse group who's playing a part in this problem solving, the group as a whole gets smarter. So there was a wonderful study a number of years ago by a Stanford business professor named Martin Roif. And Roif was interested in the social networks of unusually innovative and creative people. This is before Facebook and Twitter, so this was hard work to do. Now it would be a lot easier. So he went and he interviewed two different groups. He interviewed a bunch of innovative people who had been very successful and creative in their careers, and then he interviewed a set of people who had been less innovative in their careers, to put it gently. And he mapped all their social connections. And what he found was that there was a distinct difference between the innovators and the less innovative group, which is that the innovators had far more social ties to a much more diverse range of professions. So they themselves might have been an advertising executive somewhere, but they knew a lawyer and a poet and a plumber and a web designer, whereas the less innovative group just knew other advertising executives. And it was through the kind of diversity of exchange and collaboration, of taking an idea from one field and bringing it over to another field and putting it to use in a new context. It was through that diversity of that peer network that the innovator was able to come up with new ideas. And that truly is one of the great kind of powers that cities have, that a city like Milano has. You have tremendous professional diversity in a city like this. And you have people kind of crowded together who are sharing their ideas and collaborating with one another. And there's spillover from mind to mind as those ideas migrate around the city. So that kind of diversity is crucial to peer networks. And the other thing we've seen, particularly in the technological realm, is the power of innovation at what we would call at the edge of the network, allowing the innovation to come from the users of the service, not just the creators of the service. And there's probably no better example of that in recent years than in the case study of Twitter. I focus on Twitter not because I have so many followers on Twitter, but because it's an incredible story. This image here is from the Spanish Revolution protests in Madrid a year or two ago. And you'll see, I think this is quite remarkable, that the protester sitting in a square, having this old-fashioned kind of urban protest in a piazza, is holding up a sign that has a hashtag, a Twitter hashtag on it. It's written in cardboard, but they've put hashtag Spanish Revolution there. Some of you may know this, that the hashtag convention on Twitter, that's where Occupy Wall Street started. It was a hashtag first. They started circulating hashtag Occupy Wall Street. It was only after that hashtag started to take off on the social network of Twitter that people decided that they should actually occupy Wall Street and set up camp in downtown Manhattan, and then it turned out in downtowns all around the world. One of the most significant protest movements of the last 2 or 3 years began with a hashtag. Now, here's the thing that's interesting about this. If you could travel back in time and talk to the three guys, Evan Williams, Biz Stone, and Jack Dorsey, who were inventing Twitter in 2006. If you could travel back in time and say, guys, in 4 or 5 years, people will use hashtags on Twitter to start global protest movements. Do you know what those guys would have said? They would have said, what's a hashtag? Because hashtags were not, in fact, part of the Twitter service at all. It's not just that they had no idea that people would use their service for political protests, which is certainly true. They were trying to build a simple little status update mechanism. But they didn't even realize that hashtags were going to be part of it at all. In fact, it was users who started tagging tweets with hashtags. And I know the Twitter guys a little bit. I was talking to them about this the other day, and they said, you know, the funny thing is, somebody wrote a blog post saying Twitter should adopt hashtags as a way of organizing tweets, and we read that inside the Twitter headquarters, and we said, that is so nerdy, no one will ever do that. So even when the users started to use this kind of service in this new way, it turned out that the creators were like, no, 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 that's not going to work. And it wasn't until it became an overwhelming kind of use of the service that they finally formalized it and made it part of Twitter going forward. Now it's a key part of how the service works. It may be actually crucial to their business model in the long run because they can tie advertising to those hashtags. So they were smart enough to listen to what was happening in that larger, diverse, decentralized peer network of users of Twitter. They let the innovation come from the edges of the service towards the center, not from the center out. And that is more often than not the way that innovation happens today and the way we can ensure that more of it happens in the future. Now, I want to give you one key example here of what this means for smart cities, because I think this is the place where all of these ideas come together. Think about, for instance, a kind of Kickstarter for your neighborhood, your community. Every community has tremendous expertise on the ground. The people who live in a neighborhood know what the needs of that neighborhood are better than the experts in City Hall or in the state government or the federal government. So every community is made up of people who know what needs to be done, know where the opportunities are, know where the problems are. And what we have an opportunity to do today, thanks both to the technology and also to our understanding of how peer networks can work, is unlock all that creativity, all that capacity for change and improvement, and empower people on the level of the street and the sidewalk to make their communities better. Imagine a kind of a Kickstarter for your neighborhood where, let's say there's an abandoned lot on your street and it's being abused by, you know, kids who are hanging out there drinking beer late at night, or it's overrun with weeds and it's an eyesore. So imagine a Kickstarter-like service where somebody proposes that this is a problem, points out, you know, online that this is something that could be fixed. Other people kind of vote to support that. And then there's a Kickstarter-style referendum where people are allowed to suggest solutions to that problem. And people can say, well, I'd like to build a skate park there, I'd like to build a community garden there, I'd like to build a parking lot there, whatever the solutions are. And then the community can fund those projects directly. It's related to, in some ways, the participatory budgeting techniques that have come out of Brazil that are taking off around the world as well. In that sense, you have this amazing power of the community to solve the problems that are on its doorstep, using technology, using the platforms that have become possible, but also just using the old-fashioned word of mouth of neighbors talking to each other. And I'll show you, to leave you with kind of maybe my favorite story from the book, a story of you know, kind of a massive smart city initiative, one of the most important ones in the last 10 years, is the story of 311 in New York City. 311 is a service that's now in many cities, variations of it are in many cities around the world. The most advanced version of it is in New York City. It's one of the big projects of New York's kind of nerd mayor, Michael Bloomberg. And what it is, it does a couple things. It's a number you can call in a minor emergency. You call the 911 number when somebody is breaking into your house and the authorities need to know. But if there's something that the authorities maybe should know about, but it's not a pressing emergency, you can call 311. But more than that, it is kind of a concierge for the city's services. So you can call 311, you get a live operator on the phone, they speak over 180 languages, not just one operator, they have many. And you get to this person, you can ask them, say, are schools closed today because of the snowstorm? Is it alternate side parking today? I want to recycle my air conditioning unit. Where do I go to do that? Any question you want, They've got a set of experts who will answer it. You'll talk to a live human in 30 seconds. You can also point out problems. You can say, there's a pothole on my street. The bar down the street is making too much noise after hours, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Any kind of complaint you want to have, you can register with 311. Now, here's what makes it so powerful. It is a two-way system. It's not just the citizens of the city getting information from the city itself, but the city is learning and adapting and evolving in response to all of these calls that are coming in. So all that data is being analyzed. They have dashboards, they have maps that show where the complaints are, where the needs are. People are requesting kids events in this area that are being underserved, so we need to add more kids events here. There's a big pothole problem on 57th Street. And what they've done, in a sense, is created a peer network of everyone in the city of 8 million people who can dial 3 numbers on a phone. They've empowered all those people to contribute to that really extraordinary problem of figuring out where the problems are in a city of that size and that scale. And it enables them to be more smart, more adaptive, more responsive to changing needs, and crucially, to respond to needs that the people inside of the government, inside of City Hall, never thought of, never occurred to them. That's the power of these kinds of decentralized, diverse peer networks. When you extend the number of minds working on this problem, pointing out problems, you end up realizing that there are all these things that you couldn't see or you didn't even occur to you until you let the people at the edges of the network contribute. I'll tell you just one story of the power of 311, and then we'll move on. And it's a story that actually I experienced firsthand when I was living in New York. This very bizarre thing started to happen around 2004, which is that certain neighborhoods in Manhattan suddenly would become overwhelmed with the smell of maple syrup. So you would be walking around the streets of particularly the west side of Manhattan, and everything would smell like pancakes. All of a sudden, you could walk for blocks and blocks and blocks, and you just smell this breakfast smell everywhere you went. And so this was, this was the years after 9/11, and so people were a little nervous about unusual smells that were saturating a neighborhood. They thought maybe it was some kind of chemical attack from the, I don't know, syrup Aunt Jemima wing of Al-Qaeda. And so they would call, the 311 had just started, and so they would call into 311 and say, it smells like breakfast in Chelsea, are we under attack? And so they would do this, and the city sent out some people with sensors to check the air, and it turned out the air was fine. And so they instructed the 311 operators to just tell everyone not to panic and to enjoy the smell. It was good. But it kept happening. And the Times wrote about it, on local bloggers wrote about it. It became this kind of recurring thing. It would happen every couple of months to one of these neighborhoods. And the city, it happened so often that the city began calling them maple syrup events. Capital M, capital S, capital E, which is like the worst thriller you've ever heard, the maple syrup event. And so it went on for 3 or 4 years. And then finally, somebody inside the 311 offices said, wait a second. These calls that are coming in, these aren't just, kind of people who are worried they're under attack. These are clues. We've got data coming in from all these people. We know when and where the calls were coming from. And so they went back and they analyzed all of the information from past MSEs, and they instructed operators to get the exact coordinates of each caller next time an MSE erupted. And they took all this data and they analyzed it, and they kind of contrasted it with, or overlaid it with the weather data for each of the days, particularly the wind conditions for each of the days that the outbreak had happened. And when they analyzed all that data, it created a perfect line pointing back to a single spot in New Jersey where the smells were coming from. They were lovely smells, so I'm not saying anything against New Jersey. And then they literally drove a car over the bridge to this spot, and what they found was that there was, at this exact location, a kind of artificial flavor and taste additive plant that every so often was processing the fenugreek seed, which is used in many cuisines around the world, but in an American supermarket, you're likely to find it on the shelf where they make fake maple syrup knockoffs. And that was where this strange smell was coming from. Now, what I love about this story is, yes, it was not a chemical terrorist attack. Thank God. But when they were designing the 311 service, when they were trying to make New York into this new kind of smart city, when they were outlining what the software should do, nobody said, well, we should make sure that the software is able to detect syrupy smells and track their location, right? That was not part of the spec for this technology at all. But because it was built on a peer network, because it was listening to a much wider, more diverse set of participants, and because it was able to detect patterns in all of that data in a really compelling way, it was able to solve this problem that its creators had never anticipated. And that, I think, is the opportunity we all have with the promise of peer networks and this vision of the smart city. That if we decentralize and diversify and create platforms where as many minds as possible can contribute to the solutions of problems, we are going to get smarter as a whole. That will be the ultimate source of innovation and progress. Chance favors the connected mind. Thank you very much.